have to say, we have a constant problem in this auditorium. Everyone sits up the back. This is the first time I've seen with John here. Everyone's down the front, so thank you very much also. As we always do here, I'd like to begin our event this morning by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting, and they are the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And on behalf of all of us, I want to pay my respects to the elders, both past and present. A special warm welcome to you, John. Thank you for coming down from the Southern Highlands, where I believe there was a crisp frost this morning.
Indeed.
And I'd also like to acknowledge two of John's kids here today, Tim Olsen and Louise Olsen. And just to remind everyone about John's long relationship with the Art Gallery of New South Wales, as well as being really the doyen of Australian artists. Perhaps most notoriously, he led the anti-Archibald demonstration here in 1953, which actually resulted in, I think, the trustees losing their lifetime status as trustees.
It was a relief, really. The Conservative side of the Archibald Prize was quite good people, but infinitely dull. You see, art should not echo virtue. It should echo life, in my opinion. That's why I like Van Gogh. That's why I love Michelangelo's drawings. And William Dargie had won the Archibald Prize 7 times. They were very virtuous pictures, if you get my drift. And we were students at the Julian Ashton Art School, and really good artists had been well rejected from the Archibald. And so we decided that something ought to be done about this, and we drew up placards, which I can remember one said, how much is that Dougie in the window? Don't hang Dougie, hang the trustees. All that kind of stuff, you see. And there was the demonstration that it was featured us photographed on page 1 of the Sunday papers. And there was a big kind of public focus. And then we had another demonstration for the rejects of the Archibald Prize, which was at the Education Department. And we had a mini dummy. And it was opened by the Minister for Education. And he said, it doesn't matter what you do, things are not going to change. That is, the trustees appointed for life. Within a month, everything changed.
And of course, John, you had your ultimate revenge. John became a trustee himself. Unfortunately, just after they changed those rules. You went on to win the Wynne Prize in 1969, 1985, and then finally in 2005, John won the Archibald. Had a retrospective here in 1992, and of course now we have that second fabulous retrospective, Beaut Country. So I hope again today is very much a sense of welcoming you home to the Art Gallery of New South Wales, where you are such a significant figure in everything we do here. Just out of curiosity, in the audience, have most of you had a chance to see the exhibition yet? Excellent. Well, I hope you have a chance to see it again. I think we're down, it's up till, I think around is it the 12th of June, I think it is. So please have another look at it. So today the idea is just to have a bit of a chat with John, to give you a chance to hear John talk about the way he approaches his art, the way he has approached it, the way he continues to approach it, and how he views life. But I would like to say one more thing before I move on, and that is to congratulate the curator of the exhibition, Deborah Edwards, and her colleague at the National Gallery of Victoria, David Hurlston, for putting together this very beautiful exhibition of John's career. But first, as you will notice, there is a painting sitting on the stage with us here. And it is with enormous pleasure that I can announce that John has very kindly donated this work of art to the Art Gallery of New South Wales. So John, I want to thank you. In this painting, you can see so much of what John's art is about, this calligraphic line that moves through the landscape. In this case, a landscape that's sort of become like an animal. In fact, it is called animal landscape, sort of a zoomorphic landscape with these little figures sort of at the edge of the landscape, our little birds flying over, and is from an exhibition that's recently held at Tim Olsen Gallery here in Sydney. And John, I just wondered if you'd like to say a few words about the painting itself and how you painted it.
Looks happy. There's something about the Australian landscape that it's wild and untamed. If I thought about English landscape that Constable so beautifully painted, or I thought about European landscape that Cézanne, Monet painted. The Australian landscape is something like a dog's hind leg. It's very unruly. The ordinary notion of symmetry doesn't really exist for me. It's like an animal. I likened it to an animal, and looking at it from this perspective, it's a journey with the animal. So the notions of, say, conventional perspective, foreground, middle distance, and background, it doesn't seem to exist for me when I'm travelling through a landscape. And often I use the titles encounters or journey. This is a journey. And I'll tell you a secret, but it's a wonderful secret. There are 3 secrets, but I can only remember one. Shh. You start off and you don't know. You know, and that's something like a Zen situation with calligraphy, or say Chinese or Japanese calligraphy, that it is an adventure and you're finding out what you're thinking. I can remember when I had an art school, well, it was a kind of an art school, in which that we had a children's class, and there was a 6-year-old boy, and he was painting on the floor, and I said to him, "What are you doing? What's the subject?" And he said, "I'm drawing my think." And you see, to really find out what you are, because you see, inside our brain, magnetic fields, and it contains experience, and it has memory, but within that memory is the possibility of externalizing that memory to somehow to get in touch with your unconscious self, that latent power, that important, vital latent power to be creative, is to find out what that force is. So in order to, say, surprise yourself, that you leave yourself open. Oh, it's a high-risk area, very high risk. And so the consequence of this kind of way of working, incidentally, you can see that in Soutine, you can see it in de Kooning, is that you don't plan the thing. You have in mind a subject. Say, I'm saying to this, I'm going to the beaut country today. But it means that you don't square up things, that what I'm aiming for is to give the thing a life force, an energy force. And that's really what I've tried to do there, and it's my great pleasure to really give this, and my son has been helpful with this, to the gallery because of my very special affection for the gallery, and because of the funding. It's too bloody expensive anyway.
But thank you very, very much, John. Hey, can I do something really weird here? But I just think it's such a special moment to be up here with John with this painting. I just have to take a photo, sorry. bear with me here for 1 second. This is to, if I can find the camera function, that would be, of course. Fantastic. Here we go. Thank you, John.
I'm gone forever.
Okay, sure. Okay. Thank you. And John, thank you very, very much. It's a great thing to have this new chapter in our relationship with you at the gallery, and a painting that our audiences will enjoy for many, many years to come. But speaking again of this sort of early art making, perhaps you'd like to say a few words about some of those who inspired you early in your career, or before you even thought about having a career. I know John Passmore was an early influence, but who were the people who really, members of family, were there school teachers who unlocked that potential that you felt?
Yes, it's an interesting thing because it allows me to say this, that when I subsequently taught at now the National Art School and at the Architectural Department at the University of New South Wales, is that when a student said to me, "Oh, I have my style," or I know what I'm doing. And my own remark is, why the bloody hell are you here then? Because it's like this, that you must at one point come in contact with that great river of the past, which is not a place to stay in that river, but somehow you ought to know about the great artists of the past. It's not a limitation at all. In fact, it adds to your vocabulary. Rembrandt influenced by Rubens, Caravaggio. You've got Picasso, who's influenced by everything. And you find with whilst I think about it, and Renoir influenced by Watteau and Boucher. You see, because why are you doing this? To enlarge your own vocabulary. In that sense, the tradition is a magnificent dictionary. It's a rating station. And it's very, very foolish for any young person to think that he alone can bring forward the great richness. Think of language. Think of poetry. That the bigger your verbal capacity, the more you're able to explain what's inside yourself. It's just a fundamental but simple thing, and then you feel as though you've got a vertical spine.
In some ways, John, what you've done is you've described an art museum like the Art Gallery of New South Wales. I mean, that is what we are. We are this great river of the past, of history, where on a day like today, visitors, apart from seeing John's exhibition, can see historical Australian painting, historical European painting, Asian art, but they can also see John's work side by side with the National, this new biennial of contemporary Australian art we're putting on with the Museum of Contemporary Art and Carriage Works here in Sydney. And that is a great thing for a city with art schools in particular. It's so important for art schools, isn't it, for students to have access to something beyond what they're thinking about themselves or beyond what their particular teachers are teaching them.
Oh, look, the exhibition, there's a tiny little still life, and it's in the manner of Cézanne. It's no bloody good. But it was like this, that the teacher that I had was John Passmore, who was a Cézannist. And you either painted that way or else you were out. He'd just say, leave, just leave. So, but he was a great teacher of drawing, and I learned a lot because, like, he was so pedantic. He'd say to me, Ollie, when you're walking down the street, imagine yourself having a conversation with Cézanne. I did try that, but it was very one-way traffic. But look, on that kind of basis, that what a young artist is attempting to do is to find a valid identity, and that can only come out of a significant vocabulary. It's so obvious, but you hear this damn thing, which is, for me, so tedious, to be avant-garde. You see, the avant-garde, in looking at it from my point of view, is emphasis on newness, whereas really significant changes comes from possibility. To explain what I mean, Picasso and Braque's Cubism came out of looking at Cézanne. To see it in another context, that Van Gogh is looking for possibilities, not newness. Possibilities creates that great power, that sort of consummate power that one sees in Van Gogh. That he was mentored by Pissarro, he became influenced by a Japanese prince, and he's building, in which he can reach the point of saying, I am. And the I am is a deep thunder that still sort of rocks us and surprises to this very day. So good is that.
And John, speaking of these French artists, in 1953, I think it was, you would have seen the exhibition French Painting Today here at the Art Gallery of New South Wales. You were in your 20s. What was that like, encountering a sort of a broader range of artists, unfortunately most of whom were not in our collection at that time?
Oh, it was like a volcano. It was a great exhibition because there was Picasso, Matisse, Chagall, Braque, just absolutely wonderful thing. With regret, I have to say, and all of those pictures were for sale. None were bought.
Yeah, this is one of the great tragedies of anywhere in the art museum world. Australia had the opportunity to buy all of those paintings, and or most of them, and that was an opportunity that was missed.
Oh yes, it's look. Peter Bellew, who was working, an Australian, who was working at UNESCO at the time, and he managed to collect most of that collection. And he went to see Braque, and Braque said, "Look, if Australia decides to take it, don't tell them, but I'll give it to them." Isn't that, I mean, really, it's just so... but here we are, and
Without a collection of
no,
French
come
paintings,
on,
anyway.
here we go.
But then 3 years later, you took the next logical step, which was to go to Europe. In 1956, you sailed off to London and to Paris. What was that like, encountering not just the art, but the culture?
Well, first of all, I'll just return to Cézanne again, is that part of the limitations of my conversation with him is there was not one Cézanne in Australia, not one. And Passmore had arrived at a theory that warm colours come forward and cold colours recede. Obviously, that's a fact. So when I went to London and I saw, it was a Cézanne still life in the National Gallery, there was no theory at all. That what he was concerned about was moving a thing in space, which is to do with placement as much as it was in colour. Like, there he has Mont Saint Victoire. If you haven't seen Mont Saint Victoire, do go and see it in the south of France, Aix. And it was how to get the eye to articulate itself around, past this triangular shape of Mont Saint Victoire, and reconcile balances. But it's, in Cézanne's case, it's so deeply felt that it's just like another master he admired, Poussin. Now, there's a wonderful Poussin in Melbourne called Crossing of the Red Sea. That's what I mean. Like, when you get on to what I'm talking about, that the real depth of art comes into it because you've invited yourself to the big family. I can't advise you more than that. It'll give a depth to your understanding of that art is joining hands. There's a continuity in it, and it's very, very mysterious.
And John, when you got to Europe, how did you think about yourself there? Did you think you were sort of joining a lost family in Europe? Did you feel very different being an Australian? Did you feel like you were in a place that was familiar?
Oh, I was like a child in a lolly shop. I'm pleased to say I was influenced by everything. But you see, you've got to trust yourself. You've got to trust the filter of your personality, which is yourself. You've got to be open in order to sort of gather that kind of sort of clarity, that kind of force that great art has, no matter what one's limitations might be.
And then, John, you moved on to Spain, where I think it was not so much just the art you were encountering, it was also the country, the culture, the sea, the Mediterranean, which itself had a huge impact on you.
Oh, yes, I love the Mediterranean world. You see, the Mediterranean is like a big bath. And the big bath is that you've got the art of Egypt, and with trading ships coming across, it lands itself into Greece. And then, and we're talking of 1,000 years. And then it filters into Italy, you know? And it goes there. Then it traces itself up into France and then circles around into Spain. The interesting thing about Spain, well, there's many, I mean, there's things about Spain that I really must say impress me, that I arrived in the Costa Brava and it's lunchtime and there's I'm on a Lambretta which I fell off every day, seriously. And it was lunchtime, and it was a fishing beach, and there were nets sort of strewn across the sand, and there was a cart and a donkey. I can remember this like it's one of these moments, the serendipity moments. And I could see that the shadows were more important, or just as important, as the objects themselves. That's Spain. Huh? That's Goya. That's Picasso. Because never is he a French artist, he's a Spanish artist. Habla muy bien el español. Siempre. And from that you can see that Salvador Dali's Spent Watch. You begin to see a certain divine period of Salvador Dali in which the shadow is exploited. It's such a simple thing, isn't it? But that made all the difference to me because I could see that the shadow was as important as the object. It's a wonderful thing, which I'll soon be able to tell you about, because I can almost guess what the next question is.
Yeah, okay, this is not the most original question in the world, but 1960, you return to Sydney and you paint the great painting, The Spanish Encounter, with all of Spain in your mind.
That's right.
You paint it rapidly. It really is it's sort of quite shocking for Sydney. And to its eternal credit, having missed previous opportunities, the Art Gallery of New South Wales acquired this painting virtually on the spot.
Yeah, it cost 136 guineas. And I was delighted. The thing about Spanish Encounter, it's not so highlighted these days. It was the biggest painting that Sydney had ever seen. And it's painted on 3 masonite panels. And I had the shadow side. I had the shadow side. And the painting made itself. I painted it in 4 hours. 4 hours, and and I had an energy and a force in me that I wasn't in complete control. It's as though that the filter had passed through my personality, and I was acting more like that my hand was guided. Now, looking back on that, Paul Clay said, you must make contact with the powerful friends outside. And it did. Because in that kind of sort of brazen whiplash line, that it told the story of travelling through Spain, of encountering things in Spain. That's why I said encounter. we are voyaging in our lives, all of us. And it's this creative thing. This creative thing that we must tap onto this side, whether we're painters. There must be a creative side to our lives, otherwise we are doomed to boredom. Boredom. I'm never bored.
But John, speaking of that journey, your journey was really just beginning in Australia when you got back to Sydney. You spent time out at Hill End, and then you started creating this series, the beaut series, that of course gives the name to the retrospective exhibition. And for those of you who are familiar with the show, remember in the central space, the great ceiling painting, the summer in beaut country from the NGV, where you can recline on those chairs and look up at the painting. At that time in Hill End and around your sort of first venturings further out in the countryside, what did you feel was growing about your relationship with the landscape, as opposed to, say, your relationship to the Spanish landscape or the French landscape?
Yes, it's an interesting thing that to be an Australian artist, writer, of course, is to be an explorer. Now, I'll explain this because we are a new people in a very old continent. It has been described, Australia as a raft that didn't go anywhere, and the consequence of sort of marsupials and flightless birds and so on. But even though that sort of Aboriginal art is a most significant art, but it lacks light. It's very hard for us to perhaps grasp this, but this is a very significant question, is that Australian light had never been painted until the Heidelberg School of Streeton and Robertson Conda. That's, I think it's roughly about 1884. That's amazing, isn't it? It's so extraordinary. And neither had, like the trees or its strange plants of Banksias, ever really been painted as objects of art. Botanical, yes, but never as objects of art. Now, if you're able to grasp that situation, you can see what a great adventure we have. I mean, that's beaut. You know, that is fabulous. This unique thing of working in this very, very strange continent, a new language, a new way of feeling, a profound sense of understanding. It's unique. And I think when you grasp that somehow the sense of being rooted to the earth of Australia becomes a different thing. This is not nationalism, this is understanding.
And John, what do you think it means to be an Australian artist? You're acclaimed as one of our great Australian artists. Is it possible to still be an Australian artist when you think of access to travel, which was much less frequent when you were a student, access to imagery, all those experiences? What does it mean today to be an Australian artist, do you think? Is it changed?
I think at the moment that I am generalising, that there is a decline in the interest in the Australian landscape. I think that, say, that there is a much more cosmopolitan view of things, but I don't necessarily mean that you've got to have like Australian objects in it, but the Australianness of sensibility should somehow come into it. You can see it in Australian poetry, the best of Les Murray, by way of example, or that it's there, but you don't have to say, like, I'm Australian, and it's going to be like that. You work naturally, I think. I mean, you don't really try. I mean, there's my daughter there with Steve and their dinosaur designs, and they use nature's forms, and they're lovely objects. They're sort of resin sort of necklaces, bracelets and so on. But out of that comes like that very feeling that I'm describing. Now, they're having an enormous success in New York and London. They've just been working with a design company in Milan. It's that kind of thing that you are because you are. You know, I don't think we have to be hassled by that.
And of course, in Australia now, we have artists who bring all sorts of other experiences with them from where, you know, their families have come from outside of Australia. We always have 2 artist trustees on our board of trustees now. At the moment, we have Ben Quilty, a great sort of locally raised artist, and we have Khadim Ali, an Afghan artist, educated and grew up in Pakistan, worked in Iran. In fact, he's got a fantastic mural now over at the MCA as part of the National. His first experience were painting murals of the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran before he could sort of get out of there and get to art school in Lahore and then really revive another whole tradition. So it is a really fantastic thing now that all of these traditions are mixing in our art schools, in our art museums, hopefully, and in these sort of conversations. And speaking of that, let's just go out of Sydney for a moment. So in the late 1950s, the artist Clifton Pugh established Dunmutchen, and by the late 1960s, it was really a great meeting place for artists, and you were living there. Fred Williams, Albert Tucker, John Percival, and Arthur Boyd were also regular visitors. Perhaps you say something about that sort of milieu with artists. There were friendships, presumably a few rivalries, and again, you think of the great rivalries such as Matisse and Picasso that drove art in different directions. What was it like there?
Oh, it was interesting.
Must have been.
You see, I'd been influenced by, say, the mood that was prevailing in Europe, where it was called art informel, or in America, abstract expressionism. And I think that, like, that notion had a notion of international. In my opinion, it's visual Esperanto, but however, that, like, the influence of that kind of thing was just enormous, and I felt that with my own work that I was working at the tail end of something, and that what I really went back to was just working in the landscape. Now, what I'll say about that, though, is that I used the landscape as a studio, so I'd see something over there that I'd like, and I'd put that down, and I'd see something up there, and I'd put that down, and try to somehow fit these pieces together. You see, like, it's a very, perhaps, imaginative way, but I felt that there was something new to explore, rather than me trying to paint like de Kooning or Rothko, and wonderful artists. But you see, this is where you've got to be honest to your own feeling. When I'll use Paul Klee again, that when he came back after he'd been in Morocco for a while, and Paul Klee was very, very precocious, and he writes, "The first thing I must do is to disappoint my friends." Now that's very courageous, and that's, I mean, some of my abstract expressionist friends never spoke to me again. Oh dear. But that's how it is, isn't it? You know, you've got to somehow sort of speak to your fundamental self.
And John, at the time, another great friend of yours and influence was the sculptor Robert Klippel. I think you've said at some point was sort of a conduit of European ideas, but he was also a great reader of Hindu texts and Buddhist texts. What was it like with this sort of mixture of a lot of both old ideas and new ideas coming into the realm of art?
Well, very stimulating. Like I'd read comprehensively a wonderful book called Zen and Its Influence of Japanese and Oriental Art by D.T. Suzuki, a wonderful book in which it goes through the ethics of painting, the ethic of calligraphy, in which that calligraphy was more highly prized than painting in China and Japan. Like in a way, that landscape is how to write a landscape. And then there was the ideas of Freud. I passed over that very quickly. Everything seemed to be in a melting pot, and I've always been mad about poetry. Because what I find with poetry is that it's the extended metaphor that brings the heightened meaning. And I think that, say, in my own work, it's to do with the extended metaphor in which it's how I feel about something that is like somehow has to correlate with the subject. One thing, Spain, I must tell you this. Paellas. Yeah. Paellas. A paella is a universe. Golden rice, seafood, mussels, poultry, sprinkles of parsley coming from heaven, and then you pour chicken stock into this bubbling thing. And it's all the colour of the Spanish flag. And it's this cornucopia, this somehow enclosed in this pan, which is called a paella, and in that is a universe. Isn't that wonderful? Now, when I came back to Australia, nobody knew about paellas. That's probably my contribution.
There have been a few more. One of which is one of the great paintings in our collection, Five Bells, from 1963, which is one of the great paintings in the exhibitions. And that, of course, is another example of your direct connection with poetry, inspired by the poem by Kenneth Slessor. Would you like to talk a little bit about that painting and also then the great work at the Opera House that followed in 1973?
I was asked by my friend and art critic James Gleeson, who was the chairman of the Dobell Foundation. And we were at a merry luncheon, and he came and sat by my side and said to me, "John, would you like to do something in the Sydney Opera House?" Oh, no. Well, of course I said yes. Let's start tomorrow. But the thing about it is this, that we went, there were several sites available, but there was this, in the foyer of the concert hall, there was this 16-foot curved space, and it decided there, it was an interesting space, and at the time I wrote to Olsen, who had been, well, not paid, and you can't even call it sacked, but he just said, look, he can't go on anymore because the government had not given him the funding. So I asked him, and I said to him, is there any ideas that you might have that we could perhaps, or I could perhaps use? And he said, just swing it left to right, east to west, and make it join with the harbour. Hence there's that lovely kind of moonlight colour in it. So I've struggled very hard to get that kind of moonlight, that velvety kind of moonlight colour. And then there is the question of the theme. And I came across this poem of Slessor's. It's now a very famous poem called Five Bells. And the opening lines of it just corresponded to what was happening at the building of this grand building. Controversy for its newness. The media took it up, of course you'd expect that. That no one will ever go to an opera. It'll never be used. It's a white elephant. And the cost is extraordinary. In the fulsome, and why aren't we building more hospitals and building more schools? Tra-la-la-la-la-la-la-la. Way we go, way we go. That's Australia, yeah. And I came across these wonderful lines of Slessor, and it corresponds exactly to what was happening with the Sydney Opera House. Time that is moved by little fidget wheels is not my time. The wheels that do not move between the double and the single bell, there lies Joe, long since dead, who lies between five bells. So I had this intuition, and Slessor was still alive. And he'd given up poetry, and he just spent most of his time playing billiards and drinking in the Journalists Club. And I went to see Slessor, and he was doing exactly that. And he said, "That poem." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "I must tell you about it." He said that we worked at a newspaper called Smith's Weekly, which was a First World War soldiers' newspaper. And on Friday nights, we used to go up to the corner pub in Phillip Street, and it was a rainy night, and he said, and we heard that there was a party at Mossman. And so we gathered up ourselves, and there was a very good artist called Joe Lynch. And it was 6 o'clock closing, and Joe decided to put 2 quart bottles on either side of his raincoat. And so we went down to Circular Quay, and it was a very rainy and stormy night, and they got onto the Mossman ferry. And Slessor described to me there was much jollity. And a big liner, at one point, a big liner went past, and the ferry rocked. And after a while we said, "Where's Joe?" Joe had fallen overboard and immediately went down with the 2 quart bottles of beer in his overcoat. His body was never found. So we've got this kind of undercurrent of Sydney Harbour, its moonlight. It was the perfect theme which I felt was appropriate for the Opera House.
And it was, and it will remain one of our great masterpieces. It's an extraordinary achievement. And John, as our time ebbs away here towards the end of the program, we have appropriately landed right back here in Sydney and on the shores of the harbour. You've described Sydney as the true Aquarian city. Even more poetically, you've described it as the blue bitch goddess. What do you feel about Sydney now as a city? When you, I know you live in the Southern Highlands, but you visit us here often. What do you think about Sydney now? How does it relate to the Sydney that you grew up in, you were educated in?
Thank God for the harbour. Look, I think it's going to be, it is getting more and more difficult traffic-wise. It is, of course, very, very expensive, which it wasn't in my time. It was, in the best sense of the word, a truly provincial city. It could correspond to Christopher Wren's notion of a city in which the perfect city is one in which that you could walk out of it in a day. Not anymore. So look, it's still delightful, but I think it's much more difficult than the time when I was a young man, and it kind of comes down to the thing that it could, in a way, be too expensive for most young artists. Like that happened in Paris as well.
It's a huge problem. It's happening in New York. It happens everywhere. Artists come in and to create the life, and then things tend to become a bit gentrified, and the poor old artists get pushed out. And I think that is going to be a major challenge for art in the future. Just rent is going to be the issue as much as anything else.
Yes, Michael, you are right in so far as that in London. This has happened in the late 19th century, that artists took over the stables, which were the Mews. And in no time, the Mews became very fashionable places to live. So that kind of correspondence. Very difficult to know what will happen as far as artists living. My advice is to go to Newcastle.
But what places like the Art Gallery of New South Wales can do with names of artists around our building, of course, is to at least provide a platform for artists to be inspired by the art of the past that they all and we all inherit, and also give them platforms for showing their art to the public free of charge in exhibitions like the National. And it's a great thing that not only have you given Australia so much in the terms of art, but you've been such a great friend of this art gallery in so many different ways, including doing the very, very important thing artists do, which is protest, and to come in and to complain about the status quo, at least to challenge it, sometimes rightly, sometimes wrongly. But you've done all of that, and you've spent very generously spent time with us here this morning, sharing your wisdom and your wit and your experiences. And I just, on behalf of all the audience, I'd like to thank you for sharing that and your art with us here in Sydney.
I've got one more thing to say.
Oh, please do. Go. Be my guest.
No, I must tell you this. My show in the NGV was at a site across the road from what we'll call the main building, and the space there was just terrific. What must happen is, and Michael has launched this idea, this extension, because that makes all the difference. Because it will just be that final thing in which contemporary art will be adequately and beautifully hung. And we have to hope that does happen, because the gallery is too enclosed. There are too many good things in the cellar, and they need to be shown. Now, my last thing is, I saw a fabulous book in the bookshop.
Yeah.
And it's
This
not
is
John
unscripted,
Olsen.
I should say. I promise this is unscripted.
No, it's not John Olsen. It's when I left Julian Ashton Art School, that I came across this book. This is another, I mean, our life has to have serendipitous happenings every now and then. I came across this book called The Natural Way to Draw. And it's written by Kimon Nicolades. And here it is. Here it is. There it is.
I'll hold it for you.
Yeah. And
Photos.
And the book is not how to draw, but to learn to draw. Now, Kimon Nicolades was a lecturer at the Art Students League in New York. This book was first of all published in 1941, and I came across it in the bookshop today. If you're interested in drawing as a creative thing, it's fabulous. Show it again, because it's got sort of drawings by students. Quick drawings done by students, and it emphasises, let's be in the feely business. Let's be there. And if you're drawing something, enter into its spirit rather than the detail, because then you've got the root motivation of the movement itself. Now, this is the end of my commercial.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Thank you very much again, John. I got through perhaps about 30% of what I was hoping to cover. It's just always a huge pleasure talking with John, and I hope we have other opportunities in the future to join all of you and have another chat. Thank you very much again.